Hey everyone, this is Melissa Tondi. I'm excited to participate once again in TestFlix and welcome to TestFlix 2023. So, we're going to talk about automation and how we're doing it wrong. This is an updated talk for me. I presented this concept a few years ago and got some really great feedback. So, I've updated it a little bit from that, but I think a lot of these topics and themes throughout this talk are still very much relevant. Even when they were relevant a few years ago, they're still very much relevant today. So let's jump in, and I hope you enjoy and maybe learn something. So why so negative? Why do I use such a negative connotation or a negative title in this talk? Well, first of all, I think innovation needs to be at the forefront of what we do. And as innovators, and especially as technologists, for whatever role you're playing in within your company or your team, innovation comes when we build on our successes, but more importantly, our failures. So when we think about the failures that we've done, we should actually use those and make them right and address them. And hopefully, we fail early and often enough in our software development and software testing day to day that we get used to the failures and know that we build on those. Because even best laid plans and ideas that make it into our original playbook of how we do things should also be revisited. Just something that was put in place a year ago or maybe more may not actually apply. So we need to revisit them and make sure that they are still applicable today, that they align with our industry, and attending and presenting at and consuming from and contributing to our community through conferences like TestFlix and others help us make sure that we are actually aligned with our industry when we start looking at introducing new processes or new things to adopt. And then, of course, that they're agreed to by those expected to do the work. So it's hard to make unilateral decisions that don't wind up having negative outcomes. So when we look at our playbook and things that we do currently, we should always use the lens of these three areas to make sure that they are applicable, that they align with our industry, and that they're agreed to by those expected to do the work. So let's ground this talk a little bit by this quote. I love this quote. We've been using this quote for many, many years. And when we think about test automation, the idea is that it makes humans more efficient and not less essential. And I hope that that quote still holds true today. And I certainly hope that that holds true in your company or your organization. When we look at test automation, it should always be viewed as an enhancement and a way and a tool for us to be much more efficient and optimized in our day to day so that we can do what we do best and advocate for our humans, because we are all humans. And if humans are expected to interact with the software that we're releasing, we need to be able to think like humans. So let's talk about the wrongs that come into automation. I'm going to highlight three of those for this talk today. So where did we go wrong? Number one, we had a monolithic suite of tests, right? That may sound familiar to you. Those generally look like big multi-hour suites of test automation that are generally run overnight or after hours, somewhere where it's not going to be too impactful for the team on there because they are so big. Generally speaking, those results are vetted out by a very small group of folks, usually someone on the QA or QE team or the test automation team, especially if those folks are not embedded within project teams. And then action is generally taken by the same group of people or person, and generally in a silo. So how do we make this right? I like to use this quote here: multiple runs for multiple dones. What does that mean? Well, generally, just like DevOps has kind of introduced this over the last few years, we want to take and repurpose a lot of the concepts that have made software development much more optimized here. So instead of those big, huge monolithic suites of tests that take hours to run and overnight and off hours, we want to replace that with smaller, centralized, and much more efficient suites of tests. Those provide more concentrated and quicker feedback to the entire team. And we don't have to do anything different. And we treat this as code. So we run them in the pipeline. In a lot of cases, we use these suites of tests to sometimes gate builds in that manner. But the idea is that instead of waiting for feedback that takes hours and overnight, that we're actually creating and organizing our suites of tests so that they are actually smaller and that they're able to give much quicker feedback and information back to the team. That way, those results are available and action on by the entire team, not just one person or one role that tend to be responsible for that. So where did we go wrong? Number 2, automate everything. We have certainly heard this, and I'll kind of go back to the DevOps introduction of this term, automate everything. Not a bad concept. However, we've somehow taken and sometimes taken this to the very next level. When we think about automating everything, and certainly when we tie a certain percentage or number of test cases and then somehow equate that to higher quality, the more test cases that I've automated or the number of test cases that I've automated in this period of time somehow equates to high quality. That's still very much rampant and still a little bit of an outdated belief on why automation is something that we need to be investing in, that somehow that automation and the higher number or percentage somehow indicates a higher quality. And of course, as practitioners and professionals, we know that that's not necessarily the case. When we focus on automating everything, it becomes a numbers game. And when that becomes a numbers game, that loses the creative license of that person who's actually responsible for interacting with and advocating for our users when they're exploring and using that software. So how do we make that right? Well, first of all, know your landscape. First of all, if the testers or the QA or QE team are the only ones who are responsible for doing any type of testing within the project team, that's a great area and opportunity to address and to take action. First of all, we should be looking across the entire landscape of all testing that is done, regardless of whether or not that's done by a formal QA or tester or QE. There are lots of great software engineers and developers who thoroughly test their code. A lot of times, though, that stuff isn't necessarily documented. And we're not necessarily talking about unit and integration tests, which are generally documented. But a lot of times individuals are testing and putting a lot of quality checks that we don't really know. And so we assume that it's not being done. So we wind up testing more, or sometimes we do duplication of testing because we just don't know. So know your landscape. Consider the unit and integration tests. Also consider what types of acceptance testing your product manager or owner or any stakeholders are doing as well. Understand where all of the testing is happening, not just where QA or QE is focusing their efforts on. So when we think about how we make this right, we want to start small with automated smoke tests. And we kind of define in our organization smoke tests as being actions of CRUD, create, read, update, delete. Those tend to be the smallest and building blocks of functionality. If any one of those actions is supposed to be applicable and is somehow broken, we know that that should be treated as a very, very high priority, because we know that if that actually happens in production or in the wild, that will likely cause a lot of disruption and a lot of calls into our support or help desk teams. The other idea behind making it right here is to tie it to the definition of done or shippable. Make sure that automation is viewed as a valuable value add to the project team. By tying it to smoke test and major functionality, that's going to get a lot of the attention, especially if you are not if you find that your position or role is needing to justify the investment in automation. Hopefully that's not the case, but sometimes when it is, we want to make sure that we're tying that automation of especially the smoke test back to the definition of done or shippable, not only with that ticket or story itself, but to the entire delivery of that body of work. And then use the A of A, or automated of automatable, and I can provide more information on this to actually measure that. It'll be a much more accurate understanding of what is automated rather than just simply tying it to a number of automated test cases that had previously been written and implemented by a tester in the past. So where did we go wrong? Number 3. We've, created a siloed and non-embedded team of automation engineers, a very, popular tactic for staffing. The direction in those cases was generally to automate existing test cases. As I mentioned earlier in wrong number two, we're actually automating test cases that has previously been in either a passed or a failed state, rather than shifting that left. Those test cases have already been executing. And that really results in suppressing creativity for the folks that are responsible for delivering solutions around testing or test automation. And then that actually hinders our ability to collaborate on holistic solutions. So if you find yourself that you are in a non-embedded or matrix type of team, the automation where they're not as close to the general project team collaboration and conversations that are happening, we can make that right. And I like to kind of introduce this. I've been talking about this for about 6 or so months, about the tests as a service approach, not to be confused with testing as a service approach. The test as a service approach is a great way to address this. First of all, the way that we look at it is we organize tests in the same ways that our software engineers or developers are. Generally speaking, developers, software engineers are concentrated in an area of the code, and they're experts within those areas of the code. When we start organizing tests where only the QA or the testing team has the intuition to understand where they are and how to run them, then we miss out on providing these automated suites of tests or non-automated suites of tests where they can be and should be used by the entire project team. So if we make it easier and we make it much more intuitive for the developers to use those tests that are centralized and that are organized the same way that they are, we wind up actually delivering more powerful ways for others to share in the validation and testing of their own code, rather than having it live solely on the shoulders of the QA or QE team. Those tests should be centralized, meaning anyone on the team can run them, right? And that not just the QA or the automation engineer who has written them in there. We want to make sure that we're putting in some leave no trace types of concept, and where we might apply this to regression testing. So what this might look like in a future state is that if developer A is contributing to a specific code base or within a feature or stream, a work stream within that code base, let's provide tests that they can use on their own, that they can run locally or that they can run as part of the build process. And that way, we as in QA don't necessarily need to run those tests again, as long as those results are centralized and that the project team is actually actioning on that. That allows the QA team to focus on other areas that may not have had time or emphasis, or that have presented themselves as higher risk areas that we generally have not had the time to do so. So when we think about tests as a service, this concept allows software engineers to validate on their own, rather than, again, putting all of that weight on the QA's shoulders. So now what? Well, so where do some of these wrongs apply to you? And more importantly, where can you make them right? So A, start small. Focus on that smoke test first. Tie any type of automation of that smoke test to definition of done or shippable. That code or that story should not be considered done or ready to ship without that at least basic smoke test created, written, and then running in the pipeline. Think like a team member, even if you're not embedded. So for those of you who are automation engineers that service multiple teams, think like that team member, but also think like a human user, and that will allow you to have your creative license back as you're creating those solutions. So your end goal should be able to provide self-service tests for anyone on the team to use. That is ultimately maintained by the team rather than individuals or an individual that created that solution. That way you can focus on innovation driven by change, and then we can actually right the wrongs. So if you have questions, if you'd like to engage a little bit more on this, here's my contact information. Enjoy the rest of TestFlix 2023.